residents of Ontario, I have bad news for you. If you didn't know it already, your electricity system is broken. And I mean, really broken. Not maybe California or Texas style broken yet, but it only because you haven't had a huge climate catastrophe or weather catastrophe yet. So I'm going to talk to Ben Dachis, who's an economist with the CD Howe Institute, about a new study that he and a colleague have written that kind of at least proposes some solutions to this. Welcome to the interview, Ben.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, we're in 10, 12 minutes going to discuss a system that is just profoundly dysfunctional from top to bottom, and we're not going to be able to do it justice. So I'll try to do that in other interviews. But in this one, we're going to start out with costs. So the total system cost increased from 12 billion in 2006 to 21 billion in 2019. And that's basically what it costs to generate the power, transmit it to where it needs to go, and then distribute it out to the customers. Have I got that right? And
Yep.
Why did it increase that much over that time?
So I'll give you one word and we can unpack it further: contracts. At the root of it is that the government, the previous government in particular, signed a series of very costly contracts, in particular for green power. That gets a lot of attention. But what also often gets ignored is right after the blackout in the mid-2000s, the government also signed a lot of very expensive, in particular natural gas generating contracts that didn't give the province a lot of flexibility. So as demand in particular plummeted right after the 2008 financial crisis, these contracts started looking really expensive. These contracts gave companies a pretty steady rate of return. And as the amount of demand plummeted, these companies were left with these contracts that required that they get a certain amount of money. And that meant that the market structure that we had pre-2008, which was giving them through the what's called the hourly electricity price, the market source spot price, that was no longer sufficient to pay for these contracts. And this is where what was called the global adjustment took over. And the global adjustment has now ended up being by far the largest component of Ontario electricity expenses.
Right, that went from 700 million to 13 billion, and the government subsidy now is 6.5 billion, which is just unsustainable from your point of view. So, but maybe you could just explain a little bit where in there. Okay, so the generators got these juicy contracts, so they were being paid more, if I understand this correctly, more from the contracts, and then their costs fell. Is that where they made the extra money?
So the core problem isn't that their costs fell; it's that costs fell everywhere else, and especially in renewable power. But the contracts that the government signed didn't reflect that. If you go back to 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, the government is signing contracts for wind power. I'm going to throw out some numbers here that, for people who are following energy now will think are just astonishing. For wind, they were signing contracts that gave generators a set price of about $125, $135 per megawatt hour. If you compare that to the prices that you're seeing in Alberta now, for example, we're seeing prices for wind generation that are a fraction of that, $37 a megawatt hour. But here in Ontario, we're stuck with those contracts, and they're even juicier contracts for solar and other types of renewable power. So as the rest of the world saw the price of renewables fall quite substantially, we here in Ontario, we're stuck with these contracts with very high fixed costs.
Now, you made the point earlier that it's not just the green contracts, so we shouldn't just pick on the renewables, but did they also give excessively large contracts to gas, to nuclear, to other generators?
Yeah, gas in particular saw some pretty substantial increases. Unfortunately, it's really hard to break this out. If you go back to some of the data that the Ontario government, through the ISO, the system operator, and before that, the Ontario Power Authority produced, it's really difficult to put exact dollar figures to how much individual companies are getting. But the bottom line is that when you think about the overall system costs, and we'll get into some of the other parts, components of the system, transmission, distribution, that have gotten a lot of attention, in particular Hydro One. It's when you really look at the core problem, it is in these contracts, natural gas and green power in particular.
Right, and it's often referred to as a Frankenstein system because you've got a wholesale market, which suggests, like Alberta, that you've got a market-based system, but then you've got regulated rates, and you've got contracts laid over top of that, and the whole thing is just a dysfunctional mess from looking at it from my vantage point. Yeah,
and it's the contracts that are the tail that are wagging the dog. Where 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, we did have a functioning market, and the hourly electricity price is what set most of the rate of return, most of the revenue for these companies. But as these contracts ended up becoming more and more prominent, this global adjustment became the main source of funding and not the hourly electricity price. And more contracts and more regulation begets more contracts and more regulation. So we got to the system where we're kind of stuck with a lot of contracts. So now it's time to find a solution out of this.
Well, why doesn't the solution include the government going back and renegotiating the contracts, or going to court to break those contracts or get them reduced?
So this goes to a deeper question about the power of the state and the implications of state power. We don't get this into the paper because we want to focus on solutions within the existing market structure, within the existing legal, the existing system. But if you're a government and you decide to invalidate a contract, sure, you have the power to do that. But the lens that you have to have is, what are the implications of you doing that? What are the implications in the sector, but also in other parts of the economy that have very high cost contracts with government, whether it's on infrastructure, whether it's in health or education. There's a lot of money in the sector, and if you've got a contract with the government, you see that guy over there getting his contract shot down by the government who stroked the pen at the legislature, you may think twice about signing a contract, or ask for a heck of a lot more up front to justify taking on that expense. So you got to think very carefully about shutting down contracts if you're the government.
Now, before we get to your suggestions for solutions, this situation, as complicated and messy as it is going to get more complicated and more messy because we have a number of other factors at work here. One of them is the electricity systems around the world are being transformed by new technologies, and distributed energy would just be one of them. And there's all kinds of power grid technologies, battery technologies. We're going to have the electrification of large swaths of the economy, including transportation will be first up. So we'll have significant growth in demand. And there are all sorts of these kinds of pressures. Oh, and climate change policy, that's the one I was going, because if the government continues, if it wants to increase natural gas to make up for the nuclear power plants that are either being retired or going offline to be refurbished, then that's going to bump up against the federal government's climate targets. So all of this suggests that an electrification is going to proceed apace, and the system isn't built to accommodate it. Have I got that sort of described accurately?
I think you've got the problems described accurately. The question now becomes, what's the best way to solve the problem? So I think it fundamentally comes down to one or two visions. Vision one, and I think this is the crux of where, how we got to a lot of these problems, is this belief that the government knows the solution. Government is, through its foresight of picking green energy, low emissions electricity through the procurement process, will solve the problem. Or if you're a local distribution company, that green power is going to, and there's going to be electrification everywhere, and all the cars on our street are going to be green power. That's kind of one solution. And the other solution is, let private investors, let the market decide, and within that frame, with all the problems that you've mentioned, have only high-level policy, high-level legislation that sets out the parameters, and then let market participants figure out the solution. So I think we have to pick one of two paths. And the recommendation we come out with in our paper is very strongly and we can get to discuss the exact implications in procurement, transmission, distribution, and then on the pricing side for picking that market-based solution as the right way to address all those problems you're talking about.
Right, because Alberta is the only market-based system in Canada, the really, true market-based system. And there, the independent system operator will they can either ask somebody to bid, or you can get approved to put a new wind or solar farm online, and then you compete in the wholesale market. And so, prices are reasonably low in Alberta, and you don't have trouble bringing on new supply as demand increases. Is that the kind of direction you're talking about?
Precisely. So let's tackle climate change first, and then we can get into the nitty gritty of the Ontario electricity system first. And the simple solution is start carbon price. We now have a pretty clear policy direction from the federal government that prices on emissions are going to increase to $170 a ton by 2030. Now, the question is, that has ramifications across the economy. It has ramifications for you and my, and your listeners' car ownership. It has ramifications for industry as to whether they're going to take some of the processes that are currently petroleum-based and maybe move to electricity. It has implications for power producers, a natural gas producer deciding between a marginal investment being in a natural gas plant, which still may be really what the market needs, because we're going to increase the electricity demand so much that we need to find technically feasible solutions right here, right now, versus biomass, versus more wind, versus more solar. There are ramifications across the economy, but the best way to do this in terms of finding the lowest cost option is through a carbon price.
Okay, fair enough. But that's not what you suggest as a proposal. You've got some specific proposals and solutions, such as reduced rate subsidies. You've got proposals for large customers, medium customers, and then residential and small business customers. Could you explain those, please?
Sure. So let's talk about the two fundamental ways to fix the system. First, and by fix the system, I mean cutting costs. So first is creating the right price signals, and those right price signals are going to depend very much on the kind of customer you are. There's a different system for large industrial companies, medium-sized industrial companies, for residential and small businesses. And then we'll get into the kind of things that it's going to take to give companies the right incentive to reduce cost. So which one do you want to get into first?
Well, let's talk about the large customers, because you're talking about a market-based interruptible rate, and that I think that's becoming more common with utilities across North America.
Yes. So the way to describe the Ontario electricity pricing system for large industrial companies is it's a game of whack-a-mole, where it's called the Industrial Conservation Initiative. And the way it works in high level is they have to figure out which 5 hours over the course of the entire year are going to be the highest demand across the province of Ontario. The problem with that is no one has any bloody clue when that's really going to be. And as more companies have the system incentive to reduce their demand during the top 5 hours, guess what? That itself reduces the top 5 hours and makes it more uncertain. So it's become this more and more impossible game for companies to try to figure out. So what they've been doing is they just shut down a whole bunch of times during the summer, even when they don't have to. And this is not a market-based system. It's an arbitrary top 5 hour rule. Maybe it should be 10, maybe it should be 20, maybe it should be 0 in some years where we have tons of excess capacity for that year. So what we should be doing is instead creating a system where the market operator determines what the real cost of the system is in terms of getting new peak hour production, and then setting up a signal to the markets to say, hey, this is what the market price should be for shutting down during these top 5 hours. And as part of being, subjecting yourself to this the interruptible rate, you should get a reward. You should get a lower price for being part of it. That's how we should fix it.
Sure. Medium-sized customers, you want to set the full cost of energy prices on an hourly basis. Can you explain that, please?
Sure. So the way that remember how we talked about how global adjustment is now the major component of electricity costs. The way that works is that if you're a medium-sized customer, you only find out what your dollars per megawatt hour global adjustment component of your bill is going to be at the end of the month. So you've been running the whole month, whether it's 5 o'clock on a Friday on the hottest day of the year where everyone's heading home, power prices are through the roof, or in the middle of the night of a relatively mild day where there's very little electricity demand, your global adjustment component is exactly the same, no difference, even though the system cost is wildly different in those hours. And so that hourly electricity price for these companies does vary. They pay the hourly electricity price based on what it is actually that hour. This global adjustment, which is now the majority of their bill, is completely the same. So let's just adopt that system that we've all known of an hourly price and apply it to the global adjustment. There are ways to do it, and that will create a lot of incentives for companies to find the lowest cost time of the month, time of the day to move the production to.
And what about residential customers and small businesses? You're talking about incentives to reduce consumption at peak hours, for instance.
Right. So many people are used to this time of use system where there's effectively 2 seasons where during the winter, it's more expensive at night or the evenings when people are coming home, turning on their TVs, turning on their ovens, that sort of thing for dinner. And then during the summer where it's more expensive during the afternoon. And it's this constant seasonal pattern where every day during the fall or during these seasons, that's the system, except for weekends. That has now become only a very roughly correlated price to actual cost. What we should do instead is adopt what's called critical peak pricing, or other systems in which we forget about the pricing and just let customers hand over some control over things like their smart home devices, in terms of like you've got a Nest or an Ecobee, as as we start seeing more electric vehicles come into play. Allow power companies, as the market operator, to slow down your charging of your electric vehicle during times of real system stress. So the key thing here is really recognize that we don't necessarily need to worry about the afternoons always being a problem. It's those select afternoons where things are really in trouble, where we should create some kind of incentive for people to reduce their demand just a little bit and let the market operator give the right signals for that, and otherwise give them a lower price for the rest of the time.
Here's my takeaway from what we've just discussed, Ben, is this system is severely dysfunctional. It has really significant structural problems that aren't going to be fixed with tinkering. And I don't mean to insult your solutions, but they seem to be more tinkering than restructuring. Is that a fair comment?
Yes, I actually think that this goes to this deep philosophical discussion. Do you think that the market operator, should take on all decisions, and that the government shouldn't make these decisions about procurement, or do you think that the market, with tweaks to the market, tweaks to design and pricing, doubling down on relying on the market through tweaks is this right solution? And frankly, I believe that these solutions where we've gone more to work with government have been the crux of the problem. I go back to the contract discussion being how we got here. So if we keep on that other track where we're focusing on solutions that focus on the market, use the market, I think we've got a better chance of getting out of this alive.
One final thought, and you mentioned this in your study, and that is, this isn't just about government intervening in the market. This is really about politics intervening in the market quite often. And those are two different things, where politicians are, directing resources and fiddling with prices and so on for political reasons, not just because they're trying to solve a problem. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, so I'll give you 2 examples. The Hydro One example, and then taxpayer subsidies. So Hydro One became a political lightning rod about 3 years ago in the election. But if you look at what happened to Hydro One with their post-privatization behavior, they've actually substantially reduced their costs, way more so than any local distribution company across the province. So it's a real success story. So what we should be thinking about is actually further encouraging private investment in distribution and transmission. And and we go back to the massive need for reinvestment in the sector, where we look at green power, the electrification of everything. Where the rubber hits the road is at the distribution end. So rather than requiring cities to stump up the investment dollars and what's going to be risky capital, they should be going to private companies. They should be going to private investors. And then second of all is on taxpayer subsidies, which is that once these prices, again, go back to bad contracts. Once these bad contracts really started to bite, the only easy solution in the political cycle was taxpayer dollars. And this is just begetted more and more taxpayer dollars. And now we're at the point where we're paying more in subsidies to reduce our consumption or our prices for electricity. We're paying more for that from the taxpayer dollars. And we're paying for all of long-term care in the province, at least from taxpayer subsidy. That seems fairly misaligned to priorities of society these days. So it's time for us to maybe think about cutting back on these subsidies. Certainly once we've addressed some of these cost issues, both from the companies, in procurement, and then also getting the right price signals for all kinds of consumers.
Ben, thank you very much for this. This is an incredibly complex story. There are more layers to this onion than you can imagine, than viewers can imagine, and we'll try to peel back more of them in subsequent interviews. Thank you very much for this.
Thanks for having me on.